The chest itself was unremarkable, a plain cedar box, weathered and dark with age, its surface scored by the passage of nearly a century. It sat in the dim corner of the sacristy, a silent sentinel, gathering dust and shadows. Its iron lock, thick with rust, seemed to guard not just its contents but a profound, almost palpable silence that had settled over St. Gideon's Church for generations. This wasn't merely an old piece of furniture. It was a sealed vault of time, holding a secret so potent, so deeply buried, that its eventual unveiling would not just rewrite the history of a small Louisiana parish, but would echo through the very foundations of its oldest families, revealing a truth far more unsettling than any ghost story. Ascension Parish, Louisiana, in the year 1948, was a place steeped in the rich, heavy air of history, a land where the past wasn't merely remembered but felt, a constant presence beneath the humid sky. The Mississippi River, a broad, muddy artery, snaked its way through the landscape, carrying with it the echoes of steamboats and the whispers of forgotten eras. Along its banks, the land stretched flat and fertile, dominated by the sprawling sugarcane fields that had for centuries defined the region's economy and its social fabric. The air itself seemed to hum with the cicadas' endless chorus, thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming magnolias, and the faint, cloying sweetness of molasses from the nearby sugar mills. Spanish moss draped like ghostly shrouds from ancient live oaks, their gnarled branches reaching out over quiet, sun-dappled roads, creating tunnels of green shade that offered brief respite from the relentless southern sun. This was a South still grappling with its own identity, slowly emerging from the shadow of the Second World War, yet firmly rooted in traditions that stretched back to the antebellum era. The war had brought changes, new ideas, and a sense of accelerated progress to some parts of the nation. But in Ascension Parish, the pace of life remained deliberately slow, almost reverent. The old plantation houses, some still grand, others slowly succumbing to the encroaching vines and the relentless humidity, stood as monuments to a bygone era, their columns and verandas whispering tales of wealth and power built on the backs of enslaved labor. The social order, though subtly shifting, still bore the indelible marks of that history, a complex tapestry woven with threads of race, class, and unspoken understandings. At the heart of this landscape, nestled amidst a grove of pecan trees, stood St. Gideon's Church. It was a modest structure, built of white-painted clapboard, its steeple rising modestly against the vast Louisiana sky. The church itself was a testament to continuity, a spiritual anchor for a predominantly white Baptist congregation whose roots in the parish ran as deep as the river itself. Built in 1850, on land that had once been part of the sprawling Vauquelin Plantation, one of the largest and most prosperous sugar operations along the Mississippi corridor, St. Gideon's exuded an aura of quiet, unshakable permanence. Its stained glass windows, though simple, cast patterns of colored light across the worn wooden pews, illuminating generations of prayers, hymns, and sermons. For nearly a century, it had been a place of solace, community, and unwavering faith, a sanctuary where the past was honored and the future was met with steadfast resolve. The very ground it stood upon, however, held secrets far older and more troubling than any of its congregants could have imagined. It was into this world, this particular blend of tradition and subtle change, that Roy Dufresne arrived in the late spring of 1948. Roy was a young man, barely 27, but the war had etched lines of experience around his eyes that belied his youth. He was a carpenter by trade, a practical man with calloused hands and a keen eye for the integrity of wood and stone. He had seen things in the Pacific, in the steaming jungles and on the blood-soaked beaches, that had stripped away any youthful naivete, leaving him with a quiet, almost detached pragmatism. He had learned to assess situations quickly, to identify weaknesses, and to approach problems with a direct, no-nonsense attitude. When he looked at an old building, he didn't just see its aesthetic charm, he saw its structural bones, its vulnerabilities, the stories its timbers could tell if only one knew how to listen. Roy had been hired by the church elders to oversee a much-needed renovation of St. Gideon's. The roof leaked in heavy rains, the old wiring was a fire hazard, and the sacristy, a small room adjacent to the altar where the minister prepared for services and church records were kept, was particularly damp and neglected. It was a job that required respect for the old ways, but also a firm hand to bring the building into the modern age. Roy, with his quiet competence and his veteran's steady gaze, was deemed the perfect man for the task. He arrived with his toolbox, a roll of blueprints, and a mind focused on the practicalities of joists, planks, and plaster. He had no interest in ghosts or hidden histories. He was there to fix a church. He could not have known that the church, in its own silent way, was about to fix him, or at least profoundly alter his understanding of the world. His first few days were spent assessing the damage, shoring up weak spots, and clearing out decades of accumulated clutter. The sacristy in particular was a treasure trove of forgotten items. Dusty hymnals, moth-eaten vestments, stacks of yellowed parish bulletins, and a collection of old, unused communion chalices. It was amidst this forgotten detritus that Roy first noticed it, tucked away in a shadowy corner behind a stack of old sermon notes, a plain cedar chest. It wasn't ornate, not like the polished mahogany furniture in the main sanctuary. This was a utilitarian piece, roughly hewn, its surface dark with age and neglect. A heavy iron lock, corroded and stiff, secured its lid. It seemed to belong to another time, a relic from an era when things were built to last, and secrets were meant to be kept. Roy, with a grunt, tried to shift it, but it was surprisingly heavy, rooted to the spot as if by an invisible force. He made a mental note to deal with it later, perhaps move it to the storage shed. He had no idea that this simple, forgotten chest was about to become the epicenter of a storm that had been brewing for 90 years. The morning of the discovery dawned hot and heavy, even for a Louisiana summer. The air hung thick and still, promising a thunderstorm that never quite broke, leaving everything in a state of suspended anticipation. Roy had been working in the sacristy for several hours, the rhythmic scrape of his sandpaper against old wood, the only sound disturbing the church's profound quiet. He had finally cleared enough space to properly examine the cedar chest. It was larger than he had initially thought, perhaps 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and about 18 inches deep. The wood, though dark, still held a faint earthy scent of cedar beneath the layers of dust and time. The iron lock, a formidable piece of craftsmanship, was clearly rusted shut, its keyhole choked with debris. Roy knelt before it, running a calloused hand over the rough-hewn lid. There was something about its stubborn silence, its refusal to yield, that piqued his curiosity. It wasn't just an old box. It felt like a sealed vault, a repository of something deliberately hidden. He remembered the stories the older church members had told him about the sacristy, how it had always been a place of quiet reverence, a space where the most sacred items were kept. He also recalled a vague, almost mythical tale about a chest that had been placed there long ago, containing parish records of a sensitive nature, never to be opened. He had dismissed it as local folklore, the kind of exaggerated tale that clung to old buildings. Now, looking at the chest, a flicker of unease, a premonition stirred within him. He tried to force the lock with a pry bar, but the iron held fast, groaning in protest. Roy, a man who respected the integrity of materials, knew brute force wasn't the answer. He fetched a small chisel and a hammer, carefully working around the edges of the lock plate, trying to loosen the corroded screws. The metal shrieked faintly as the rust gave way, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed sacristy. With a final, decisive tap, the lock mechanism groaned, then snapped, the heavy iron falling away with a dull thud against the wooden floor. A wave of musty, ancient air, thick with the scent of old paper, dried wood, and something else. Something indefinable, like forgotten memories, wafted up from the chest. Roy hesitated for a moment, a strange reluctance holding him back. It felt almost sacrilegious, an intrusion into a long-held secret. But his practical nature won out. He gripped the lid and slowly, deliberately, lifted it. The hinges, surprisingly, moved with a soft creak, as if waking from a long slumber. Inside, the contents were neatly arranged, almost meticulously so, defying the 90 years of neglect. The first thing Roy saw was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover dark with age, lying squarely in the center. Its pages, though yellowed, appeared remarkably preserved. Beneath it, tucked carefully, was a sealed letter, folded multiple times and secured with a faded red wax seal. Its paper was thick, of good quality, and the handwriting on the outside, though elegant, was unfamiliar. Beside these, a second document, a formal-looking parchment, was rolled and tied with a thin, brittle ribbon. And then, almost hidden beneath the ledger, was a small hand-drawn map. Its lines faded but still discernible, sketched on what looked like a piece of heavy linen. Finally, nestled in a corner, wrapped in a piece of surprisingly soft, faded cloth, was a small, delicate object. A woman's hair comb carved from bone, its teeth still intact. Roy stared, his mind struggling to process the unexpected tableau. This was no ordinary collection of forgotten parish records. The meticulous arrangement, the sealed letter, the map, the personal item, they all spoke of deliberate intent, of a story carefully preserved, waiting for its moment to be told. He reached in, his fingers trembling slightly, and carefully lifted the ledger. Its weight was substantial, its leather cover smooth and cool beneath his touch. He opened it to a random page, and his eyes fell upon the elegant, precise script of Aldous Vauquelin, the name he recognized from the church's founding history. The entries were chillingly formal, a meticulous accounting of human lives. A sudden sharp rap on the sacristy door made Roy jump. Reverend Clyde Arsenault, the elderly pastor of St. Gideon's, peered in, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Roy, my boy, everything all right in here?" Heard a bit of a commotion. Reverend Arsenault was a man of 78, his hair a wispy white halo around a kindly, weathered face. He had served St. Gideon's for over 40 years, a gentle shepherd to his flock, his sermons filled with comforting parables and calls for community harmony. He represented the unbroken continuity of the church, a living link to its past, though he knew nothing of the chest's true contents. He had inherited the sacristy and the chest within it as simply another fixture of the old church, a relic of a time before his own. Roy, still holding the ledger, turned slowly. His face was pale, his usual practical demeanor replaced by a look of profound bewilderment. "Reverend," he began, his voice a low murmur, I think you need to see this." He gestured to the open chest, its contents now fully revealed in the dim light filtering through the sacristy window. Reverend Arsenault stepped inside, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. He saw the ledger in Roy's hands, the sealed letter, the map, the comb. His gaze settled on the chest, then on Roy's face, then back to the chest, as if trying to reconcile the mundane reality of the old box with the extraordinary implications of its contents. A tremor ran through his frail frame. "The chest," the Reverend whispered, his voice barely audible. It was never to be opened." He moved closer, his hand reaching out, then hesitating, as if afraid to touch the artifacts of a forgotten past. His eyes, usually twinkling with gentle humor, were now wide with a dawning horror. Roy watched as the color drained from the old man's face, leaving it ashen. It was the face of a man watching his life's foundation crack beneath him, the bedrock of his faith and his community suddenly shifting, revealing an abyss he never knew existed. The silence in the sacristy deepened, heavy with the weight of 90 years of unspoken truth, now, finally, irrevocably, brought to light. Before we continue with the story of St. Gideon's Church and the secrets it held, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single chilling tale. And tell us in the comments below, what state or city are you listening from? We love to hear where our community stretches. The leather-bound ledger, once a mere object of curiosity, now felt like a living, breathing testament to a forgotten cruelty. Roy and Reverend Arsenault carefully laid it open on the sacristy table, its pages brittle and yellowed, emitting a faint, sweet scent of aged paper and dried ink. Aldous Vauquelin's elegant, precise handwriting filled the pages, a script so perfectly formed it seemed almost artistic, a stark contrast to the chilling nature of its content. It was, as Roy would later reflect, the penmanship of a man who had convinced himself that what he wrote was not monstrous, but merely an orderly accounting of his earthly possessions. The ledger was a meticulous record of the enslaved people on the Vauquelin plantation, spanning from 1839 to 1857. Each entry was a stark, dehumanizing catalogue, reducing human beings to commodities, their lives quantified in dollars and cents. Yet, within this cold accounting, Aldous Vauquelin's personal notes, scribbled in the margins or beneath the formal entries, revealed a profound and disturbing awareness of the very humanity he sought to deny. Roy, his brow furrowed in concentration, began to read aloud, his voice low and steady, giving voice to the silent records. Nora, he read, his finger tracing the elegant loops of the name. Age approximately 19 in 1839, assigned value $700, intelligent, quick to learn, keep from books. Reverend Arsenault gasped softly, a sound of profound distress. Keep from books, he murmured, his voice trembling. What kind of note is that? Roy continued, turning the pages, each entry a fresh wound. Dade, he read. Age approximately 14 in 1839. Assigned value, $600, strong, willing worker. Easily influenced. Clara, another entry. Age 28 in 1845, assigned value, $1,200. Good cook, manages kitchen well, mother to little May. Henry, Roy continued, his voice growing heavier with each name. Age 35 in 1848, assigned value, $1,500, skilled carpenter. Has attempted to abscond twice. Broken of the habit. The words broken of the habit hung in the air, a chilling euphemism for unimaginable suffering, a stark reminder of the brutal realities of the plantation system. Bess, he read, age 22 in 1840, assigned value, $900, field hand, good with cotton, sister to Tom. Tom, followed immediately, age 20 in 1840, assigned value, $950, field hand, strong, watches Bess too closely. The ledger continued, a litany of names, ages, and assigned values, each entry a life reduced to a number. The dollar values, ranging from $600 for a young, strong male to $1,800 for a highly skilled individual, were historically accurate for enslaved people on a Louisiana sugar plantation in the 1840s and 50s. These were not abstract figures. They represented the brutal economic reality of human bondage. Little May, Roy read, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. Age 3 in 1845, assigned value $300, child of Clara, frail. The simple, almost tender note, frail, stood out amidst the clinical entries, a fleeting glimpse of something resembling human concern, quickly overshadowed by the cold calculation of her assigned value. Edmund, he continued, age 40 in 1850, assigned value $1,000, overseer's assistant, loyal, has reported others. A shiver ran down Roy's spine at this entry, a chilling insight into the internal dynamics of control and betrayal within the enslaved community. Ruth, he read, age 17 in 1850, assigned value $800, house servant, quiet, good seamstress. Amos, another entry, age 25 in 1852, assigned value $1,300, blacksmith, valuable skill, resentful. The word resentful was underlined twice, a silent warning from Aldous Vauquelin to his future self, or perhaps to his successor. Patience, Roy read, his voice steady despite the growing weight in his chest. Age 30 in 1855, assigned value $1,400. Wet nurse, good with infants, has lost 2 of her own. The raw, unvarnished tragedy of that last note, casually appended to an inventory, was almost unbearable. It spoke volumes about the casual cruelty, the profound disregard for human suffering that underpinned the entire system. George, age 28 in 1855. Assigned value, $1,350. Field hand, strong, brother to Will. Will, age 26 in 1855. Assigned value, $1,300. Field hand, brother to George. Often together. Florence, Roy concluded, his voice a low rumble. Age 20 in 1855. Assigned value, $750. Good with children, quiet, will not cause trouble. Reverend Arsenault sat heavily in a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands. The ledger, with its elegant script and its brutal content, was a testament to a profound moral blindness. Aldous Vauquelin, a deacon of this very church, a man who preached the gospel of Christ, had meticulously recorded the lives of human beings as property, noting their skills, their relationships, their perceived character flaws, and even their deepest sorrows, all while assigning them a monetary value. He knew who these people were as human beings. He saw their intelligence, their resentment, their familial bonds, their suffering, and yet he chose to treat them otherwise. The ledger was not just a record of ownership. It was a chilling psychological portrait of a man who had rationalized the monstrous, who had used the precision of his penmanship to impose order on an inherently disordered and inhumane system. The silence in the sacristy was no longer merely dust-laden. It was heavy with the echoes of those names, those lives, those unspoken tragedies. After the chilling revelations of the ledger, the sealed letter, folded multiple times and secured with its faded red wax seal, took on an almost sacred significance. Roy carefully broke the brittle seal, the faint crack echoing in the quiet sacristy. The paper, thick and cream-colored, unfolded to reveal a script as elegant and precise as Aldous Vauquelin's, yet imbued with a different kind of power. It was the voice of Nora, the woman listed in the ledger, the one Aldous had noted to keep from books. Her letter, addressed simply to whoever opens this, was the emotional and narrative centerpiece of the entire discovery. Roy began to read, his voice hushed, giving life to words that had been silent for 90 years. To whoever opens this, my name is Nora. I was born on this land, on the Vauquelin Plantation, in the year of our Lord 1820, or so I was told. My mother was Clara, a field hand. My father, I never knew. My life, like the lives of all those around me, was not my own. It was a life of labor, of obedience, of constant watchfulness. Yet even in such a life, the mind can find its own paths. I learned to read and write not from a teacher, for such a thing was forbidden to us, but by observation. The Vauquelin children, Master Aldous and his sister Miss Eleanor, had their lessons on the veranda. I was often tasked with bringing them refreshments or sweeping nearby. I watched their tutor, a kind but oblivious woman, trace letters in the sand, heard her recite the sounds. I saw the books, the way the symbols on the page transformed into words, then into stories, then into knowledge. At night, by the dim light of a stolen candle, I would practice, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick, then on scraps of paper I found, mimicking the elegant script I saw in the master's ledgers. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with danger, but the hunger for understanding was a fire that could not be extinguished. I learned the language of the masters, not to speak it, but to understand their world and perhaps to find a way out of it. Over many years, a quiet understanding grew among some of us, a shared yearning for freedom, a belief that another life was possible beyond the cane fields. We spoke in whispers, in glances, in the subtle shifts of our daily routines. The river, the great Mississippi, was not just a boundary, it was a path, a promise. We knew of the networks, the whispers of the Underground Railroad, the routes north. But the Vauquelin Plantation was vast, isolated, and heavily guarded. Escape was not a matter of impulse. It was a matter of meticulous planning, of patience, of courage. I became by necessity the architect of our hope. My ability to read allowed me to study maps, to understand the currents of the river, to decipher the few coded messages that sometimes found their way to us through sympathetic travelers. I devised a system of my own, a code woven into the patterns of the cloths we made for the household. A certain knot, a specific color thread, a particular stitch. These were not merely decorations. They were messages, directions, timings. We communicated under the very noses of our overseers, our hopes and fears stitched into the fabric of our daily lives. The plan came together over nearly a decade. 14 of us, bound by a shared dream, prepared for the night of August 14th, 1857. We had gathered what little we could. Dried provisions, a few tools, the clothes on our backs. Our destination was a point upriver, where a contact, a free man of color, was to meet us with a flatboat, ready to carry us further north. The moon was new, the night dark, the air heavy with the promise of rain. We moved like shadows through the cane fields, our hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope. There was Clara, my mother, her face etched with a quiet determination. There was Henry, the carpenter, his hands, usually so strong, now trembling with anticipation. There was Bess and Tom, always together, their hands clasped. There was Patience, her eyes reflecting the quiet sorrow of a mother who had lost too much, now seeking a future for what little hope remained. And there was Dade. Dade was a strong man, a good worker, but his spirit was restless. He yearned for freedom with an intensity that sometimes bordered on desperation. He had been approached by Master Aldous, offered a promise of manumission, his own freedom, in exchange for information. We did not know this then. We trusted him. He was one of us. We reached the riverbank, the dark water swirling silently past. The contact was there, a small boat waiting. Our hearts soared. We began to board, one by one, the silence broken only by the lapping of the water against the hull and the rustle of the reeds. And then, the shouts, the barking of dogs, the blinding glare of lanterns. We had been betrayed. Chaos erupted. Some tried to run, scattering into the darkness. Others fought, a desperate, futile struggle against overwhelming numbers. I remember the sounds, the cries, the crack of whips, the heavy thud of bodies. I remember the faces of the overseers, grim and determined. I remember seeing Dade, standing apart, his face a mask of anguish, watching as his choices unfolded into tragedy. By the morning of August 15th, I was the only one of the 14 who had not been returned to the quarters. I do not know why I was kept. I have thought about this every day since. Perhaps it was my perceived intelligence, my ability to read and write, which Master Aldous had discovered in the aftermath. Perhaps he saw a different kind of value in me, a value beyond the fields. I was not freed. I was kept, and I was watched. Every shadow, every whisper, every movement was scrutinized. My life became a cage of constant surveillance, a living testament to the consequences of hope. I do not write this with anger towards Dade. He was promised what we all wanted. I do not judge him for wanting it. I judge the man who made him choose, the man who offered a sliver of freedom in exchange for the destruction of so many others. That is the true cruelty. I have placed this letter, along with a few other items, into this chest. I do not know if it will ever be found, or if its contents will ever be understood. But I believe that truth, like the river, will always find its way. It may be diverted, it may be damned, but eventually, it will break through. If you are reading this, you found what he believed he had buried. He was wrong about many things. He was wrong about this too. He believed he could control the narrative, that his version of history would be the only one. But the truth has a way of persisting, even in the darkest corners. I have done what I could with what I had. The rest belongs to time. Nora, who was here. Roy finished reading, his voice hoarse, the last words hanging in the air, heavy with the weight of Nora's quiet dignity and profound suffering. Reverend Arsenault sat motionless, his face pale, tears streaming silently down his wrinkled cheeks. The sacristy, once a place of quiet reverence, now felt charged with the echoes of Nora's voice, a testament to a strength that transcended the brutality of her circumstances. Her restraint, her factual recounting of unimaginable horror, was indeed more devastating than any cry of anguish could have been. It was a testament to the enduring power of truth, patiently waiting for its moment to emerge from the shadows. Nora's letter is a powerful reminder that history is often written by the victors, but the truth, as she said, will always find its way. What are your thoughts on her incredible courage and resilience? Share your theories and reactions in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and share it with anyone who appreciates a deep dive into untold histories. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like Nora's to light. The silence that followed Nora's letter was profound, broken only by the distant chirping of cicadas and the soft rustle of the aged paper as Roy carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the chest. Reverend Arsenault, still visibly shaken, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. "My God," he whispered. "My God, what have we found?" Roy, his own emotions a turbulent mix of anger and sorrow, reached for the second document, the formal parchment rolled and tied with a brittle ribbon. He untied it carefully, the ribbon crumbling slightly in his fingers. The document, written in the same elegant hand as the ledger, was a church covenant dated October 1857, just 2 months after the failed escape attempt. Roy began to read its chilling preamble. "We, the undersigned members of St. Gideon's Baptist Church, in the spirit of Christian fellowship and the preservation of communal harmony, do hereby agree to maintain silence regarding the events of August 1857 concerning the Vauclin Plantation. Furthermore, we covenant to ensure the record of what was done remains within the care of this congregation, not the courts, for the sake of peace and the continued prosperity of our parish." Below the preamble were 11 signatures, meticulously penned. Roy read them aloud, each name a fresh blow to the Reverend's already shattered composure. 1. Aldous Vauclin. 2. Thomas Dubois. 3. Elias Albright. 4. Samuel Miller. 5. Joseph Fontenot. 6. Caleb Begnaud. 7. Daniel Landry. 8. Matthew Hebert. 9. Paul Broussard. 10. Peter Thibodeau. 11. William Thorne. As Roy spoke each name, Reverend Arsenault flinched, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. "Dubois, Miller, Fontenot, Landry, Hebert," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. These are the names of our founding families, Roy. The pillars of this community. Their descendants still sit in these pews every Sunday." The implication was stark, undeniable. 11 prominent men, leaders of the church and the community, had not only known about the brutal suppression of the escape attempt, but had actively conspired to cover it up, to bury the truth for the sake of communal harmony and continued prosperity. They had signed their names to a pact of silence, ensuring that the official record, the legal consequences, would never see the light of day. The church, meant to be a beacon of moral truth, had instead become an accomplice in its suppression. Roy's gaze then fell upon the small hand-drawn map, sketched on a piece of heavy linen. It depicted a section of the Vauclin Plantation land, specifically the area near the river. The lines were simple, almost crude, but clear enough to identify landmarks. A bend in the river, a cluster of cypress trees, a faint outline of a path leading from the plantation quarters, and scattered along the riverbank at irregular intervals were small, hand-drawn crosses, 14 of them. Roy pointed to the crosses, his finger hovering over the faded ink. 14, he stated, his voice flat. Nora said 14 of them tried to escape, and she was the only one who wasn't returned to the quarters. Reverend Arsenault stared at the map, his breath catching in his throat. The meaning of the crosses was unmistakable, a silent, chilling testament to the fate of the 13 who did not survive the betrayal. They were not buried in the church cemetery, not in consecrated ground. They were buried hastily, anonymously, along the riverbank, their graves marked only by these crude symbols on a secret map. The events of August 1857 were not just a failed escape. They were a massacre, covered up by the very men who led the community and the church. Roy felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. He had seen death in the war, violent and sudden, but this was different. This was a calculated, deliberate act of erasure, a systematic burying of truth and humanity, sanctioned by the very institutions meant to uphold justice and morality. His anger, usually a controlled, simmering heat, began to rise, a slow, burning rage against the hypocrisy and the profound injustice. He looked at the Reverend, whose face was now a mask of profound grief and shame. The old man's composure had completely deteriorated, replaced by a raw, visceral anguish. The foundations of his life, his faith, his understanding of his beloved church were not just cracking, they were crumbling into dust. The weight of 90 years of silence had finally been lifted, and its burden was crushing. The weight of the documents, the ledger, Nora's letter, the covenant, and the map, was too heavy for Roy and Reverend Arsenault to bear alone. The truth they contained was not merely historical. It was a living, breathing entity that demanded to be acknowledged, to be understood by those whose lives it had shaped, even unknowingly. Roy, with a clarity born of his war experiences, knew that this was not a matter for the church alone. This was a matter for the community, for the descendants of both the enslaved and the enslavers. He thought of the names in the ledger, the names in the covenant, and the complex, intertwined history of Ascension Parish. He knew he needed help, a perspective that could navigate the treacherous waters of race and history in 1948 Louisiana. His thoughts turned to Margaret Turode. Margaret was a black school teacher in the parish, a woman of quiet strength and profound intellect. She was in her late 40s, her demeanor always composed, her eyes sharp and perceptive. She carried herself with an innate dignity that commanded respect, a dignity forged in a world that often sought to deny it. She was known for her meticulous research into local history, particularly the stories of the black community, often overlooked or deliberately erased from official records. Roy had heard her speak at a community meeting once, her voice calm but firm, advocating for better resources for the colored schools. He knew she possessed the intellectual precision and the moral fortitude to confront the truth they had unearthed. It was a bold move, bringing these documents, these explosive revelations, to a black woman in a white church in 1948 Louisiana. The unspoken rules of the South were rigid, the racial lines sharply drawn. But Roy, having witnessed the raw brutality of war, had little patience for such artificial boundaries when faced with a truth of this magnitude. He approached Margaret at her small, neat home on the outskirts of town, the heavy cedar chest carefully placed in the back of his truck. Reverend Arsenault, still too distraught to accompany him, had given his reluctant blessing, understanding the necessity, if not fully embracing the implications. Margaret greeted Roy with her usual calm politeness, her gaze assessing, but not unwelcoming. When Roy, with a nervous tremor in his voice, explained what he had found and why he had come to her, her expression remained impassive, though a flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. She invited him in, offering him a glass of iced tea, her movements graceful and unhurried. As Roy carefully laid the ledger, Nora's letter, the covenant, and the map on her kitchen table, Margaret approached them with a reverence that surprised him. She didn't immediately touch them, but rather stood back, her hands clasped, her gaze sweeping over each item, absorbing their silent testimony. The air in her small kitchen, usually filled with the scent of baking bread and old books, now crackled with an almost electric tension. Finally, she reached for the ledger. Her fingers, long and slender, traced the elegant script of Aldous Vauquelin. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages, moving with a speed that suggested a deep familiarity with such records, or perhaps a profound intuition. Roy watched her, holding his breath, as she turned page after page, her expression unchanging. Then she stopped. Her finger paused on an entry, her gaze fixed. Roy leaned closer, trying to see what had caught her attention. It was the entry for Florence. Florence, Margaret read aloud, her voice soft, almost a whisper, yet resonating with an unexpected depth. Age 20 in 1855. Assigned value, $750. Good with children, quiet, will not cause trouble. She looked up, her eyes meeting Roy's. There were no tears, no dramatic outburst, only a profound, almost ancient sorrow that settled over her features. Florence, she repeated, her voice barely audible. This was my grandmother, Roy, my mother's mother. She was among the 14. My mother told me stories, whispers of a great sorrow that befell her family, a silence that was never explained. She spoke of a sister, a brother, lost to the river. But she never knew the full truth. She never knew this. Roy felt a chill run down his spine. The ledger, once an abstract record, had suddenly become intensely personal, a direct link to the living history of the parish. He saw the weight of generations of unspoken pain reflected in Margaret's eyes. She closed the ledger slowly, her movements deliberate, as if handling something infinitely fragile. My grandmother, Margaret continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength, was indeed good with children. She raised my mother and helped raise me, with a kindness that belied the hardships she must have endured. And she was quiet, always quiet. Now I understand why. She then picked up Nora's letter, reading it in silence, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as she absorbed every word. When she finished, she looked up again, her gaze piercing. Nora, she said, a note of reverence in her voice. She was a woman of extraordinary courage, to learn to read, to plan such an escape, to write this letter. It is a testament to the indomitable spirit that even the cruelest system could not break. The conversation that followed was not one of recrimination or anger, at least not from Margaret. Instead, it was a quiet, measured discussion about the implications of what they had found. Margaret spoke of the burden of history, the way the past, unacknowledged, continued to shape the present. She spoke of the families in the parish, both black and white, whose lives had been built on this foundation of silence and injustice. Her composure was extraordinary, a testament to a strength that had been honed by generations of enduring hardship and injustice. Roy, who had witnessed the raw, visceral emotions of war, found himself humbled by her quiet power, by the profound weight of understanding she carried with such grace. He realized then that the chest had not just revealed a secret, it had revealed a profound truth about the very fabric of their community, a truth that Margaret Turreau, more than anyone, was prepared to face. The documents, particularly Nora's letter and the ledger, raised a question that gnawed at Roy and Margaret, a lingering shadow amidst the already dark revelations. What had become of Dade, the man who had betrayed his own people, promised freedom by Aldous Vauclin? Had he received his reward? Had he truly been freed, or was his fate another layer of the plantation's intricate web of deceit? Nora's letter had spoken of Dade with a chilling lack of anger, a profound understanding of the impossible choice he had been forced to make. Dade was promised what we all wanted, she had written. I do not judge him for wanting it. I judge the man who made him choose. This statement, more than any other, highlighted the moral abyss into which Aldous Vauclin had plunged, manipulating human desperation for his own ends. Roy and Margaret meticulously combed through the ledger, searching for any further mention of Dade after the August 1857 entry. They found it, a single line, the very last entry in the book, dated October 1857, just 2 months after the failed escape attempt. It was written in Aldous Vauclin's precise hand, devoid of any personal notes or emotional inflection. Dade, removed from service. Debt settled. That was all. No explanation, no location, no record of manumission, no indication of where he went or what his debt settled truly meant. The ambiguity was deliberate, a final, calculated act of control by Aldous Vauclin. Roy and Margaret spent hours discussing this cryptic entry. Removed from service. Roy mused, tapping his finger on the ledger page. It could mean he was freed, sent away, or it could mean something far worse. It's too vague. Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze distant, as if peering into the past. In those days, removed from service could mean anything from being sold to another plantation, far away, to being disposed of. And debt settled is even more chilling. What debt? The debt of his betrayal, or the debt of his very existence? They checked the parish courthouse records, searching for any document of manumission for a man named Dade from the Vauclin plantation. There was nothing. No official record of his freedom. This absence was not definitive proof of his continued enslavement or demise, as manumission records could be incomplete or deliberately obscured. But it certainly did not support the idea that Aldous had kept his promise in a straightforward, legal manner. The question of Dade's fate became a haunting echo, a testament to the ultimate powerlessness of those caught in the system of slavery. Aldous Vauclin, the meticulous record-keeper, had chosen to leave this one entry deliberately opaque. Had he kept his promise to Dade, granting him freedom, but doing so in a way that left no official trace, perhaps to avoid setting a precedent or incurring the wrath of his peers? Or had he, once Dade had served his purpose, simply eliminated him, ensuring that the secret of the betrayal died with the betrayer? The ledger offered no answers, only a chilling void. Aldous kept his promise, Roy said, his voice heavy with cynicism. Or he didn't. There's no way to know, and that's the point, isn't it? He controlled the narrative, even of Dade's fate. He left just enough ambiguity to maintain his own twisted sense of justice, or perhaps to assuage whatever sliver of conscience he possessed. Margaret looked at the map again, at the 14 crosses near the river. Perhaps, she said softly, Dade's debt settled meant he was simply added to the count, unceremoniously, after his usefulness had expired. A final cruel irony. The ambiguity surrounding Dade's fate was, in its own way, as devastating as the explicit horrors revealed in Nora's letter. It underscored the absolute power wielded by men like Aldous Vauclin, a power that extended even to the erasure of a life, leaving behind only a cryptic phrase and an enduring question mark. It was a stark reminder that in the world of the plantation, even a promise of freedom could be a trap, and even a betrayer could become a victim, swallowed whole by the very system he sought to escape. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Ascension Parish intensifies with the chilling mystery of Dade's fate and the silent testimony of those 14 crosses. What do you think happened to Dade? Was he freed, or was his debt settled in a far more sinister way? Let us know your theories in the comments. And if you're finding this story as gripping as we are, please consider supporting Liturgy of Fear by becoming a channel member or leaving a super thanks. Your support helps us uncover more of these forgotten histories. Amidst the weighty documents, the ledger, the letter, the covenant, the map, there was one object that stood apart in its simplicity, yet held a profound, almost heartbreaking significance. The woman's hair comb, made of carved bone, carefully wrapped in a piece of faded cloth. It was a small, delicate item, its teeth slightly worn, its surface smooth from years of handling. It was not a grand piece, not an heirloom of wealth, but a personal, intimate object, a tangible link to a life that had been systematically erased. Roy picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. The bone was cool and smooth, the carving simple but elegant, a testament to a quiet artistry. He knew instinctively that this was not an object that belonged to a plantation mistress. This was something crafted by necessity, perhaps by love, from the meager resources available to an enslaved person. To confirm his intuition, Roy took the comb to a skilled craftsman in Baton Rouge, an elderly man known for his expertise in antique tools and folk art. The craftsman examined the comb under a magnifying glass, his weathered fingers tracing its contours. "Cattle bone," he pronounced, his voice raspy. Hand-carved, no professional tools, likely made by someone with patience and skill, but without access to a proper workshop. A personal item for sure, not something you'd buy in a store. His words confirmed what Roy already suspected. The comb belonged to an enslaved woman, a piece of her identity, her daily ritual, carefully preserved. The comb, then, was Nora's, or perhaps Clara's, or Florence's, or Bess's. It belonged to one of the women whose lives were reduced to numbers in Aldous Vauquelin's ledger. It was a silent, poignant counterpoint to the cold, clinical records, a whisper of humanity in a world that sought to deny it. But the comb, along with Nora's letter, presented the most perplexing and enduring mystery of all. How did these items, so deeply personal, so profoundly incriminating, end up sealed inside a chest in the church sacristy, a place of such guarded sanctity? How did Nora, an enslaved woman under constant surveillance after the failed escape, gain access to the very heart of the white community's spiritual domain? How did she know the chest would be sealed, preserved, and eventually opened 90 years later? Roy and Margaret spent countless hours poring over the church's old blueprints, studying the layout of St. Gideon's as it would have been in 1857. The sacristy was a small private room, accessible only through a door from the main altar area or a small, rarely used side entrance. It was a place where the minister prepared, where sacred vestments and communion vessels were kept, and where sensitive church records were stored. It was not a place where an enslaved person, particularly one who had just been involved in a major escape attempt, would have had unsupervised access. The risks would have been immense, the consequences unthinkable. "It doesn't make sense," Roy muttered, tracing the lines on the blueprint. "She couldn't have just walked in there, not after what happened. She was being watched. She said so herself." Margaret, her brow furrowed in thought, considered the possibilities. Perhaps she had an accomplice within the church, someone who believed in her cause, someone who could have placed the items for her. But the covenant, signed by 11 prominent members, suggested a conspiracy of silence, not of aid. The only possibility that seemed to hold any weight, however unsettling, was one that neither of them wanted to fully articulate at first. It was a theory so audacious, so profoundly contradictory to everything they knew about Aldous Vauquelin, that it seemed almost impossible. "What if," Margaret began, her voice barely a whisper, "what if Aldous Vauquelin himself placed Nora's letter and the comb inside the chest?" Roy stared at her, his mind reeling. Aldous? The man who wrote the ledger? The man who signed the covenant to bury the truth? The man who made Dade choose? "The same man," Margaret affirmed, her gaze steady. "Think about it, Roy. Who else would have had the authority, the access, the knowledge of the chest's purpose and its eventual sealing? Who else would have been able to ensure these items were preserved, untouched, for 90 years, in the very heart of the institution that sought to suppress their truth?" The idea was profoundly disturbing. It suggested a level of internal conflict within Aldous Vauquelin that was almost unfathomable. Why would he, the architect of the cover-up, the meticulous record-keeper of human property, also be the one to preserve the very evidence that condemned him and his community? Was it guilt? A profound, unacknowledged guilt that gnawed at his conscience, compelling him to preserve a record of the truth even as he actively suppressed it? Was it a form of record-keeping, a twisted desire to ensure that, even if the courts never knew, God or at least future generations would? Was it a desperate final act of a man who, despite his monstrous actions, could not entirely extinguish the flicker of humanity within himself? Perhaps he saw Nora's letter, not as a threat, but as a testament to a truth he could not deny, even to himself. He sealed it away, not to destroy it, but to preserve it, knowing that one day the truth would demand to be heard. The comb, then, became a symbol of this profound contradiction. A simple personal object, a tangible piece of Nora's life, placed by the very man who had sought to control and erase her. It was a silent, eloquent question mark at the heart of the entire story, a final, inexplicable act that defied easy answers. The chest, it seemed, was not just a repository of secrets, but a testament to the complex, often contradictory nature of the human soul, capable of both immense cruelty and a strange, almost desperate need for truth, even if that truth condemned itself. The year was 1948. The chest had been opened. The truth, raw and unvarnished, lay exposed on the sacristy table of St. Gideon's Church. Roy Dufresne, the pragmatic carpenter, had read it. Margaret Thureau, the dignified schoolteacher, had read it, recognizing her own family's history within its pages. Reverend Clyde Arsenault, the gentle pastor, had seen his life's work, his understanding of his community, crumble before his eyes. The documents existed. The names were real. The events of August 1857 were no longer whispers. They were concrete, undeniable facts. But what happens when a community, built on generations of silence, is suddenly confronted with such a devastating truth? There would be no trials. The perpetrators, Aldous Vauclin and the 10 other signatories of the Covenant, were long dead, their bones resting in the very cemetery that bordered the church. There would be no arrests. The legal system of 1948 Louisiana was not equipped nor inclined to prosecute historical injustices of this magnitude, especially when they implicated the founding families of a prominent white parish. What actually happened was far more subtle, more insidious, and in its own way, just as revealing of the enduring power structures of the time. Reverend Arsenault, after days of profound introspection and anguished prayer, made a decision. He understood that to publicly expose the contents of the chest, to publish Nora's letter and the Covenant in the local newspaper, would not only tear the community apart, but would likely be met with fierce resistance, denial, and potentially violence. The racial tensions of the era were too volatile, the ingrained prejudices too deep. The truth, he realized, could be a destructive force if unleashed without careful consideration. Instead, he chose a path of quiet, internal reckoning. He convened a private meeting, not of the entire congregation, but of the most senior elders, men whose families had been pillars of St. Gideon's for generations. He laid out the documents explaining their origin and allowed them to read the ledger, Nora's letter, and the Covenant for themselves. The reactions were varied: shock, disbelief, anger, and in some cases a profound, unsettling silence. 3 families whose surnames appeared on the Covenant, the Dubois, the Millers, and the Fontenauds, were quietly informed of their ancestors' involvement. The conversations were discreet, held behind closed doors, the details never publicly disclosed. Within a month, all 3 families, prominent members of St. Gideon's for decades, quietly left the congregation. They did not make a scene. They simply stopped attending, their absence a silent, yet palpable acknowledgement of the unbearable weight of their family's past. Their departure was noted, whispered about, but never openly discussed. The fabric of the community had been irrevocably altered, but the surface remained largely undisturbed. The documents themselves, the ledger, Nora's letter, the Covenant, and the map, were not destroyed. Reverend Arsenault, guided by a newfound moral clarity, understood their immense historical value. He arranged for them to be turned over to a historical archive in New Orleans, a reputable institution known for its preservation of Southern history. It was not a courthouse, not a newspaper, not a public forum for immediate justice. It was a place of scholarly record, a repository where the truth could be held, protected, and eventually perhaps understood by future generations. Margaret Thureau, however, ensured that the story would not be buried again. With her characteristic precision and unwavering resolve, she wrote a careful, detailed account of what had been found, contextualizing the documents within the broader history of slavery and the black experience in Louisiana. She included her own family's connection to Florence, giving a human face to the names in the ledger. She deposited her account with the same archive, under her own name, ensuring that Nora's voice and the voices of the others would be heard, not just through the cold facts of the documents, but through the lens of lived experience. The parish of Ascension never officially acknowledged what happened. No plaques were erected, no apologies issued, no public ceremonies held. The silence, though fractured, largely persisted. The old plantation families continued their lives, their histories now subtly, irrevocably tainted by a truth that had been brought to light. St. Gideon's Church continued its services, its pews filled with descendants of both the signatories and, unknowingly, some of the enslaved. The physical structure of the church had been renovated, its leaks fixed, its wiring updated. But its spiritual foundation had been profoundly shaken, its history forever marked by the cedar chest and the secrets it had held. The archive, however, held the record. And in the quiet halls of history, Nora's voice, and the truth she had so bravely preserved, waited patiently for the day when the world would be ready to truly listen. Even after the chest had yielded its devastating secrets, even after the documents had been carefully catalogued and placed in the New Orleans archive, one profound mystery remained, a haunting echo that resonated long after the initial shock had faded. What happened to Nora after 1857? Her letter, so precise in its recounting of the betrayal and her subsequent surveillance, offered no clues about her ultimate fate. She simply vanished from the historical record, a ghost in the annals of time. Roy and Margaret, driven by a shared need for closure, searched diligently for any trace of her. They scoured census records from 1860, hoping to find her listed, perhaps under a new name or on a different plantation. Nothing. They examined manumission records from neighboring parishes, desperate for any indication that Aldous Vauquelin, in some final, inexplicable act of conscience, had granted her freedom. Again, nothing. There was no death record for her on the Vauquelin plantation, no burial entry in any local cemetery. Nora, the intelligent, courageous woman who had dared to dream of freedom and to record the truth, was simply absent from every official document after the summer of 1857. She was there in the ledger, a number, a property. She was there in her letter, a voice of extraordinary clarity and restraint. But after that, silence. She just disappeared. Roy murmured, frustration etched on his face as he reviewed the empty records. It's as if she ceased to exist. Margaret looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the sugarcane fields stretched endlessly under the Louisiana sun. Perhaps that was her final act of defiance, she suggested softly. To become unrecordable, to slip through the cracks of a system that sought to define and control her very existence. Did she escape, eventually? Did she manage to find her way north, perhaps through another more successful network, leaving no trace behind? The Civil War was only a few years away, bringing with it the promise of emancipation. Did she live long enough to see that dawn, to experience even a moment of true freedom? Or did she die on the Vauquelin plantation, perhaps from illness or from the lingering consequences of her failed escape, her death as unrecorded as her life had been controlled? Nobody knew, and perhaps that unknowing was the most honest thing this story could offer. It was a stark reminder of the countless lives that were lived and lost under the brutal system of slavery, lives that were deemed unworthy of official record, their stories deliberately erased, their fates left to the cruel whims of their enslavers. Nora's final words in her letter echoed in their minds. I have done what I could with what I had. The rest belongs to time. It was a statement of profound resignation, but also of enduring hope, a belief that even if her own fate remained unknown, the truth she had preserved would eventually find its moment. Her disappearance was not a failure. It was a testament to the ultimate powerlessness of the historical record to fully capture the human spirit. Nora, the woman who learned to read in secret, who orchestrated an escape, who wrote a letter that would shake a community to its core, remained, in her final act, an enigma. She was a symbol of the countless untold stories, the unrecorded acts of resistance, the quiet dignities that persisted even in the face of unimaginable oppression. Her final mystery was not a void, but a space filled with the echoes of all those who were never fully seen, never fully known, yet whose lives, like hers, left an indelible mark on the landscape of history. Roy Dufresne, the young carpenter who had pried open the locked cedar chest, carried the weight of its contents with him for the rest of his life. He never spoke about it publicly, never sought fame or recognition for his discovery. The experience had profoundly altered his perception of the world, deepening the quiet pragmatism he had acquired in the war into a profound understanding of the hidden currents of history and human nature. He continued his carpentry, building and repairing, his hands always busy, but his mind often returned to the sacristy, to the musty scent of old paper, and to Nora's precise, unwavering voice. In a private journal, found after his death in 1989, at the age of 68, he had penned a final poignant reflection. The worst thing about that chest wasn't what was in it. It was knowing it had been there the whole time, every Sunday, every baptism, every funeral. The whole community gathered around something they thought was holy ground, and underneath it was a truth nobody wanted to name. It taught me that the past isn't dead, it's just buried, waiting for someone to dig it up. The cedar chest itself, now empty of its original contents, was eventually donated to a museum in New Orleans, a silent artifact of a profound historical moment. It sat in a climate-controlled display, a testament to the power of hidden truths. The comb, Nora's simple hand-carved bone comb, was never catalogued as a separate item. Instead, it was carefully placed alongside Nora's letter, sealed within an archival sleeve. They remain together, the tangible and the textual, a silent, enduring testament to a life of courage, a story of betrayal, and a truth that refused to stay buried. The story of the locked church chest and the plantation secret it held is not merely a tale of a single discovery. It is a profound reflection on the architecture of silence that entire communities build around terrible knowledge. It speaks to the enduring power of those who, like Nora, dare to record their truth, even when the world conspires to erase it. It reminds us that history is not just found in grand narratives and official documents, but in the quiet whispers, the hidden objects, and the courageous acts of individuals who, against all odds, refuse to be forgotten. The past, as Roy Dufresne understood, is always present, waiting for us to listen, to learn, and to finally acknowledge the truths that have long been buried beneath our feet. What do you think of this story? What does Nora's courage mean to you? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts. And if you found this journey into a forgotten past compelling, please like this video and share it with others. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these powerful, untold stories to light. Thank you for listening.